Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mute everybody because we'll just do the brachot before learning, because otherwise it's a cacophony. And so I'm going to share my screen for you to see the prayer. Hope it comes. The screen will go blank in a minute, so just it'll reappear.
Okay.
It didn't.
No, it did.
Yeah.
Do you see it?
Yes.
Okay. Now we're gonna mute everybody.
Is it on video?
Mute all.
Yes, everybody's watching you, dear. I'm gonna do a real close up.
All right.
How
How do you mute?
Adonai.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam,
Asher
asher
kitshanu
kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot b'divrei Torah.
Harevna Adonai Eloheinu
b'divrei Toratcha v'chinu.
V'niyeh anachnu b'tzatzaenu b'tzatza'ei Amka Beit Yisrael Kulanu Yodei Shmecha U'mdei Toratecha Lishma Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu Torah Li'amo Yisrael Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato Baruch atah Adonai noten ha'Torah. Well, everybody, thank you for joining us. We're very fortunate today that we have Steve Bookbinder will be our darshan, and we hope to see you in the next two. We'll have January 2nd will be David Rosenson, and I will do the January 9th. So take it away, Steve Bookbinder. Unmute him.
He's
You gotta unmute him.
he's doing
Oh, Steve, open your microphone.
Yeah. Marty, you're going to call on people and unmute people and such.
Oh, that's right.
do it.
So what we're going to do is to make it easy, is just raise your hand in the screen. If you want to use the chat thing, you can, but sometimes it's just easier to do this. And when you want to say something, just put your hand up, and I'll call on you, and you can share. All right, that keeps everything at least well organized and eliminates confusion.
You can raise your hand this way.
Your screen is on.
Right.
Your share screen.
Your share screen is on, Marty.
Oh, yeah.
Ah,
Okay. Now we're going to go to the Parsha.
Okay. Vayigash.
I want it.
Yes.
A very rich Parsha.
Screen.
I'm going to try to get through two sections of the Parsha that are very different. It's also referred to by one Yiddish scholar as one of the great Geschichtes of the Bible, a great story. It's almost like a serial, a TV serial. Last week, we found that Joseph, referred to by many scholars as Joseph HaTzadik, the righteous one, what does he do? He plants a goblet, his most important goblet, the symbol of Egypt, of his divination, as it says, in the saddlebags of Benjamin. He sets up Benjamin, essentially. He has his servants do that. And then when he is caught, Joseph brings the brothers back and says, I'm going to keep Benjamin as a slave. End of the chapter last week. What's going to happen? So that is the scene as we open up. The word Vayigash, which is the first one, is literally translated as approached. But the scholars say he's almost done something remarkable. Here he is, Judah the shepherd. Judah the shepherd, who, by the way, if you remember, was the one who suggested, don't kill Joseph, send him away as a slave. And whatever happens to him, happens to him. He goes to his father and lies that he's probably dead. This is Judah, who is now approaching his brother Joseph. And Joseph knows that Judah was the one who did it. And so we go to the first words, and I'm going to read this in a dramatic way because it is dramatic. And in fact, what I want to talk about are emotions and motivations, right? What is this all about? So starting at the chapter, Then Judah went up to him. And again, the commentary says he approached him very closely, almost whispering to him. And this is unheard of, to approach a prince of Egypt when you are a shepherd. You are lower than low. The Torah goes on to say the shepherds are worse than the herders. And he said, please, my Lord, let me, the servant, appeal to you, my Lord. And he repeats this, my Lord, and do not be impatient with me, your servant, you who are the equal of Pharaoh. My Lord, have you a father or another brother? We told my Lord, we have an old father, and there is a child of his old age, the youngest, his full brother is dead. Again, they are the two children of Rachel. Yes. And the youngest, his full brother, so he's left alone. His father dotes on him. Then you said to your servants, bring him down to me that I may we said to my Lord, the boy cannot leave his father. If he were to leave him, his father would die. But you said to your servants, unless your youngest brother comes down with you, do not let me see your faces. When he came back to your servant, my father, we reported my Lord's words to him. Later, our father said, go back and procure some food for us. We answered, we can't go down. Only if our youngest brother is with us, we can go down, for we may not show our faces to this prince unless our youngest brother is with us. Your servant, my father, said to us, as you know, my wife bore me 2 sons, but one is gone, and I say, alas, he was torn by a beast, and I've not seen him since. If you take this one from me too, and he meets with disaster, you'll send me down to Shul, essentially to sorrow forever. Now, if I come to your servant, my father, and the boy is not with us, since his own life is so bound up with us, when he sees that the boy will not be with us, he will die, and your servants will see the white head of your servant, our father, go down in grief. Now your servant has pledged to himself for the boy to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, I shall stand guilty before my father forever. Therefore, please let me, your servant Judah, remain as a slave to you, my Lord, instead of the boy. And this should be translated, the word is na'ar, it's more like a youth. Instead of the youth, and let the boy go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father unless the boy is with me? Let me not be witness to the woe that would overtake my father. 12 times he uses the word father in this brief section. What are the emotions here? Anyone? What are the emotions and the motivations? Anybody?
He's desperate. I mean, he's just desperate. I did raise my hand, but no one called on me. So
Okay.
I just spoke up.
Velda, go ahead. He's desperate.
Go ahead, Velda.
He's just willing to do anything, you know. I mean, he has regrets, and he's just like, okay, just take me. I'm just, you know, we gotta save the dad.
He has regrets.
Yeah.
He has what else? Just picking up on the regrets comment. What would you say? Any
Yes.
thought?
Who else wants to share?
Okay.
All right, Mac.
Well, he also obviously has guilt. And
Yes.
This is, you know, eating at him.
The guilt is eating at him, one could say. So his motivation is to somehow do this. And one might argue that that motivation is clouded by what? By guilt, which means that he's trying to find some way, and some of the commentators talk about this, to do what? To achieve
Atone.
what?
To atone.
To atone. He is in fact said, there are some commentaries who say he is the first person to do some form of tshuva. He is there, he is pleading with this guy. He risks his own life, perhaps, by being a shepherd and approaching so intimately the Prince of Egypt, who is surrounded by, you know, bodyguards and couriers and all sorts of people. So there's a lot of emotion here. And then we go to the first verse of chapter 45. V'lo yachol Yosef lehitapek l'kol hanitzavim. Joseph could no longer, he cannot, lo yachol, control himself before all his attendants. And he cries out. And let's go to the next page, the top. Everyone get out of here. Everyone, all of you, the Egyptians, leave. So there is no one else about. When Joseph made himself known to his brothers, his sobs were so loud that the Egyptians could hear. And so the news reached Pharaoh's palace. Why is he so overcome with emotion? What is this? What are these emotions? What are these motivations? What has he done already recently? Thoughts? From anybody?
His love for his family is overcoming all of the other feelings he might be feeling. Anger, resentment. Judah has touched him and reminded him that he still loves his family.
Judah has reached him. I think that's very well put, David. Judah has reached him. And not only that, he just can't control himself.
Maida. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Let's hear from somebody else.
All right, Maida, please.
I'm just going to say it's also Judah's behavior. Judah's doing a selfless thing. He's actually offering to give up his own life to save Benjamin and his father. And that's a noble thing to do out of these brothers that didn't seem very noble to him.
Yeah. He is in a sense emotionally persuaded, you could say, Maida. I would agree with you very much. What else? What else?
Go ahead.
About this interchange.
This might be the first time that Joseph actually hears what the brothers told his father.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That he was devoured by a wild animal.
Yeah.
And that's another part of the story that he didn't know.
Yeah. Yeah, Maida.
Yeah, I had a different thought, which is the fact that Joseph lives in isolation. He may have all of this power, but he's always other. And this is, in a sense, the time when he could be surrounded by his family and be part of others like himself, rather than always being the other, no matter, other things.
Yeah, it's this incredible sort of duality that he has. He is a prince of Egypt. And in the previous parsha, and the parsha before that, he is given an Egyptian princess as his wife. So he is the total Egyptian. He's the second person in command of the entire country. And at one point it says he is a father to the Pharaoh, implying that the Pharaoh is younger than him and that the Pharaoh regards him as a wise advisor. And then these people come on and they're his family. And this is a reconciliation, almost. It's a coming together of this family, which must be shocking to him, the feelings that have welled up, right? And he just can't control himself.
Well,
Steve Broder.
Yeah, and to build on, Steve, what you're saying, one of the things that strikes me here is a couple of the details that they give about when he breaks down. The text goes out of its way to tell us how unusual this is, either for Joseph or for a leader. So it says he does this in front of the Nitzavim, his attendants. And then they repeat the sobs are so loud that not only do the other Egyptians hear him, but it makes its way even to Pharaoh. So I think it's telling us something about Joseph, that Joseph perhaps is not a person who reveals much of the emotion, and certainly about his position of, the head, or almost the head of the country, and breaking down so publicly. I think they're really telling us how deeply this has gotten to Joseph the person.
I think that's a very thoughtful comment, Steve. It's again, just to reinforce, he's lived this life as a prince. He's been in prison. He's been the interpreter of dreams. He's been at the top of everything. And all of a sudden he's sort of confronted with, this situation. So he literally has to sort of take that one identity and kick it out of the room for now.
Anybody else? David, before we get to David, is there somebody else who'd like to share? Okay, Ruth Friedman, but looks like Dawn Friedman. Trying to unmute you. Go ahead, unmute yourself.
Don, you there?
Yeah, I'm sorry. While Judah may have atoned, he also was dishonest. In this repetition of the story of what happened, and Joseph, the emotion of Joseph, may have some mixed with regard to dealing with that fact. He doesn't mention it again. He sort of goes on with it. Don't be distressed and don't reproach yourselves and so forth. And I don't really, not sure what I'm doing with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's very complicated. The rabbis disagree a lot about these emotions and motivations. But what is clear is he's also now realizing that it's on him now. He's, if you think of Judah doing tshuva, what is the responsibility of Joseph? What is the responsibility, Don? You're shaking your head.
No, I'm just thinking.
Okay.
David, is or rejected as not being in true tshuva, whether it's.
So what does he have to do? What's he on the spot to do? To forgive.
To forgive or to challenge.
Okay, so here we see for the first time in the Tanakh, really, this notion of tshuva and forgiveness. If he is going to forgive, and that's what we're going to see. But just to reiterate,
David had his hand up.
David, go ahead.
This is a seminal moment for Joseph, because seeing his family in front of him, they're having come to Egypt because there's a famine. It all makes sense to him now.
Yeah.
Because the entire story has come together for him. That it is, he can now forgive his brothers because he now sees that everything that has happened to him is part of God's plan. Until they showed up, he didn't know that. This is the culmination of his story. It all makes sense to him now.
Yeah, I mean, and we're going to go on to sort of see what David is saying come to reality. But again, what is great for all of us is to see this sort of, as we think about the implications, when someone does tshuva, even if he's wronged you, do you forgive him? How do you forgive him? What happens when your emotions just overcome you? Before he is articulate about what he's feeling in the way that David just described, he's overcome. So
but he can forgive now because he now sees that there's a larger context.
He now sees, and we're going to hear
what the brothers did to him.
Absolutely. So again, just to go back to Judah for a second, because he is a player here. He pleads. He can't bear the pain of seeing his father destroyed. It took a lot of courage on Judah's part. He may have even sacrificed he could have been sacrificing his life, one commentator says. And what's interesting about Judah is, Judah's a very controversial character. I don't want to go into the story of Tamar and all that. But Judah changes who he is, according to some of the commentators. And Judah of all the brothers is the spokesman. Judah of all the brothers who basically caused the crime that hurt his father so much, he is the one who finds the empathy for his father, which is a startling sort of notion, okay? And this is why this story is so amazing. But in the interest of time, I want to move on a little bit. Rashi says, by the way, that Joseph, in this moment of being overcome, was embarrassed. He couldn't explain things to himself. He's humiliated his brothers, and now he's realized the error of his ways. Rabbi Shahel talks about the fact that humiliation is a sin. One midrash says it would be better that I killed myself than to humiliate my brothers. And, you know, in the face of all this familial mishigas, Joseph still is about to forgive. We go to verse 4. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come forward to me." And when they came forward, he said, "I am Joseph. Is my father still well?" But his brothers couldn't answer him. They were so dumbfounded on account of him. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come forward to me." And when they came forward, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Now don't be distressed or reproach yourselves because you sold me. It was to save life that God sent me ahead of you." This speaks to what David Rosenson just said. It's almost like it's a divine plan. It's now 2 years that there's been famine. There's still years to come. And if we go to verse 8, he says, "So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me a father to Pharaoh, lord of all his household, and ruler over the whole land of Egypt." I mean, not only is he powerful, but he has a big ego as well. He is the father to Pharaoh, he says. But he does see this as part of God's plan. It's bashert. It's, you know, it's going to happen. He reframes the discussion. What do we think about this? What do we think about this from a psychological point of view? Because we've got psychiatrists, we've got psychologists on this.
Come on, guys, step up.
Steve Gelder, what do you think about
Steve?
this?
Yeah, Steve Gelder. We're gonna shame you anyway. Go ahead. Go for it. You unmute yourself. There we go.
You know, I'm still focused on how he's flooded with emotion and how contradictory those emotions might be.
Yeah.
And so reframing it puts it in a context, gives it a meaning and a purpose, and mutes some of the intensity of the mixed feelings that he must be having when he's overwhelmed. But I don't know that a psychological explanation really does justice to the divine plan.
Well, I think that that's the interesting thing when people psychologically, you know, when people believe that God has made this way, that I just have to deal with what I've been presented. and the ability of the person to, I was thinking about it from a psychological point of view, to almost like cognitively, cognitive therapy, Aaron Beck, to sort of reframe the discussion so that the brothers don't bear the guilt. What do you think about that?
You know, I think there's a tension between a psychological, I mean, you know, there's a tension between a psychological explanation and the sort of telling of the story. So that the people are, so Joseph in a way becomes a very real human being in his distress, his, you know, you know, what does he have to do vis-a-vis his brothers, and this sort of realization of of the telling of the story of the of divine, you know, divine guidance of the story. So but if you want to say it's a cognitive intervention, a la Aaron Beck, that's fine.
All right, Frank.
Ask just a logistic question first. I don't see any of the typical Zoom tiles on the top. Is that correct, Marty? I'm not supposed to be seeing anybody but the person speaking on my screen?
Switch to gallery view.
Switch to gallery view.
Oh, where's gallery?
All right, well, you're figuring that out. Why don't we go to Zelda, and I'll come back to you.
No, I was just going to say, it's almost a mechanism for Joseph to forgive them. You know,
very interesting.
Yeah, because when you believe that that's the way it was supposed to be anyway, it's almost like you're forgiven for throwing me to the wild animals, you know.
Yeah. You know, throughout our history, there has been this tension of trying to explain whether this is God's will and how do I live with whatever it is I'm facing. How do I explain this as God's will? How do I see this as, in the sense of reframing almost, how do I deal with this stuff? In other words, he must have enormous resentment against his brothers for what they did. But there is this ironic twist, so that his brothers, in a sense, don't have to bear the guilt anymore. He forgives them. And it, again, for all of us who've had complicated families over the years, some people you talk to, some people you have a tougher time talking to, you know, how do you deal with these mixed feelings that you occasionally have? Jim Kugel, who writes about Joseph, says that in many ways, Joseph's response is almost an Egyptian response, that God sent me to do this, that I am the wise and almost godly prince who has patience. I am the sage, and that this was what princes in the Near East ideologies were always presented out. But in a sense, one of the commentators says he has essentially freed himself from the emotional prison of resentment and of hate, because he could have easily hated them. And it's a great lesson for us that we're not prisoners, you know, in essence, why I think of the therapeutic issue. And Lord Jonathan Sacks says, in many ways, he has a commentary who he says, we are not prisoners of events, but we can actually shape them. And that in a sense, this is the psychological point of where the story is. What Sacks goes on to say, which I think is controversial, is, but this is very much Jonathan Sacks, we must see life as challenges that are divinely intended. Challenges that are divinely intended. Who wants to say they believe that? Bob,
Michael actually had his hand up. You want to say something, Michael, or you want to pass?
Sure, I'll say something. Well, I would never pass an opportunity to talk. You know that. I don't know. I've always found Joseph to be the most unappealing of these beginning stories, and I mean, he was obnoxious as a child, and while of course his obnoxiousness didn't warrant what his brothers did to him, nevertheless, he's hardly an admirable character. And in some respects, you know, I mean, he knew what he was doing, and he knew what he was doing by garnering his father's affection to the detriment of his siblings, which is, you know, a pretty serious psychological thing. And it's always been all about him. And even as we read the story now, I mean, the word "I" keeps appearing throughout this. You know, I'm going to provide for you. I'm going to take care of you. You come down here, I'll take care of you. I'm a prince. Look what I've done. I've managed to pull myself up by my bootstraps, notwithstanding what you jerks did to me. I made myself into the father of Pharaoh, and now I'm going to, you know, and I'm so magnanimous, I'm not even going to, you know, don't worry about it. Don't reproach yourselves, and I'm going to take care of you. And, you know, there's not an ounce of real psychological insight that says, you know, maybe I made it too much about me, and I should have made it more about you. And now maybe that's too much of a 21st century read. Maybe we're supposed to read this as setting forth, you know, showing yet again that God has a divine plan, and we all just and everything falls into place because God has a plan for all of us. And if we're bound by that restriction, then sure, you know, the story fits within there. But if we're supposed to read it in modern times, I think Joseph still has an incredible amount of work to do on himself, and to recognize, and he still doesn't recognize at the end of the story, he still doesn't recognize that, you know, I've made it all about me. And then as Wes was saying in the last Talmud class, you know, he goes on and really makes it hard for the Jews to thereafter, who go into slavery for 400 years, because this guy was such a harsh ruler that it basically enslaved the Egyptians. So yeah, when there was a change in administration and they had a chance to wreak their revenge, they were pissed, and they did so, and we all paid the price because he wanted to be the powerful guy and show the Pharaoh about how he can make things run efficiently. So part of God's plan. Well, as Diane says, well, maybe that's part of God's plan too. So all right, we'll let it go.
Makes for a heck of a musical.
But I mean, on a psychological individual level, I find him, you know, he was obnoxious to begin with, and now he's a grown up, and he's still obnoxious, and it's all about him. He's grown a little bit. He shows some forgiveness, but I think he has a lot of work to do.
Michael, I'm so glad you're on the call. I think that
Frank, we come back to Frank. Are you okay?
Yeah.
Bob had a comment.
With my wife's help, I figured it out. I can see all of you now. So a couple of, do I have the floor? Because I think,
and then Bob.
A couple of things. Steve, was it you who asked a couple of minutes ago about how we feel about Lord Sachs' notion that these are sort of like divine challenges that God intends us to have?
Yeah.
It strikes me that that's sort of antithetical to what Harold Kushner has said ever since the publication of When Bad Things Happen to Good People, which is that God is hands off. The world was created, and then it's our job to run the world. And in many respects, we do things that create bad situations, and bad things can happen to very good people. And I agree with you that that's one aspect of Lord Sachs that I wouldn't call it troubling, but it's certainly something that one would think about, although I happen to greatly admire that guy. The other thing that comes to mind, thinking about Joseph's reaction here and his turning this into an aspect of God's plan, that this is what God intended. You guys threw me in a pit, but I wound up being able now to save everybody. Is there not some link between this and what we often hear after a disaster involving religious people? And I'm thinking, for example, of the horrible shootings, not the Tree of Life Synagogue, because Jews don't tend to do this so much, but certainly that church in South Carolina where the guy went in and was ostensibly studying and then shot up the place. One of the first things those people did was say, "We forgive him. He's okay." Is that a larger or even a more intense aspect of what Joseph is saying here? You put me down.
I think that poses the
guys
question.
kick me off, and I'm going to turn this into something God wants.
That's right. The Christian notion is you can't understand God's plan. They take it one step further, that suffering is part of God's plan. But I do think this is an interesting question about the person who believes, we often in the Talmud class deal with this notion, do you believe in God? Do you see life as challenges, again, as Sachs says, that are divinely intended, that there is some sort of divine plan and we have to just cope with it? It's what led some people, it is in modern Israeli literature and commentary, there is an intense argument about the meaning of the Holocaust and the response to the Holocaust. And we won't resolve it today. I want to move on to some things, but Bob, you had a question, you had a comment, and I want to make sure you get it.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, I thought that his reference to God's plan is both, he's being a real mensch here. He's not only accepting and being forgiving to his brothers, but he's basically taking them off the hook. It wasn't going to follow God's plan. And second, I think, this is where he's confronting the complete inexplicable. His brothers were trying to kill him, and his brothers, sold him into slavery. And he just, no matter what, he can't figure out. And here they are in front of him, and Judah is speaking for them and is being a total mention. How could these people have done this to me? And I think he just can't understand. And it's many things. When good things happen to bad people, the whole notion that there's things that in life that are inexplicable, and people of faith say, well, we can't always understand what God has in mind for us. And I think
exactly. And
before we go on, Steve, could we just call in David Rosenson? He's been very patient, and then let's move on. Is that okay?
But I just, before we go on, I do want to point to, I think we're seeing all the polar discussion that's in a lot of the commentaries. I think that Michael Gardner's point, he's always, I think, masterfully provocative about whether Joseph really is a tzaddik, or do we see him, because the thing that's most disturbing is this planting of the goblet in the last parsha, because it's so manipulative. And yet at the same time, there is a lot of, and that you shouldn't humiliate people, which goes back to the 10th century with people commenting on Joseph's behavior. And at the same time, Bob's point about others viewing it as a matter of tshuva and forgiveness. And it has implications for all of us. And as I said in the literature on the Holocaust, do people believe that they were too willing to believe in God, that they should have fought back, or that there really is a divine plan, which is what the Orthodox say? That's why they don't even accept,
they all do refer to him as Yosef HaTzadik.
Yeah, and yet there are even people, for example, to this day, who don't accept that there's a modern Israel because it's not according to the way God's plan went.
Just to, could I elaborate on Michael's point?
Yeah.
Until his brothers show up, Joseph is motivated by ego, certainly. That's a constant with him. But also a selfless desire to protect the nation from the coming famine. Once he sees his brothers, he becomes an Israelite chauvinist.
Yep.
He is no longer acting just out of his political actions are no longer motivated simply by selflessness and helping the nation. He is favoring a certain people over others. He sets up the the children of Israel in a special location, a favored location, a protected place. So it's not just that he has treated the Egyptians harshly. At the same time, he has favored his own in a way that creates resentment.
Yeah, and I want to go. Wes made this point about whether he treated the Egyptians harshly. We'll get to that because that's another section here in this, and I want to move along for that reason. But I think
Relly Dibner's been waiting patiently, and I'd like to unmute her and let her share.
Go ahead, Relly.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that whether you believe in God or God's plan, or you don't believe in God's plan, there is an opportunity here for Joseph to act he actually could have carried a lot of resentment, and he has an opportunity to, if you will, go to a higher level, and a higher level of forgiveness opens up a whole other way of being, if you will. And I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is sort of the psychological interpretation as well, which is interesting. I want to go to verse 14 because it's interesting on that page, and he goes through this, and you can see for yourselves, my brother, that it's indeed who I am speaking to. You must tell my father about my high station. And then what he does is he embraces his brother Benjamin around his neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his neck. And only then were the brothers able to speak with him. But if we go to verse 22, this is interesting. To each of them, moreover, he gave a change of clothing. But to Benjamin, he gave 300 pieces of silver and several changes of clothing. And when we go to verse 24, there's a different sort of, so he's once again, he can't get out of his own mindset that his mother is Rachel and Benjamin is his only true brother, which again complicates things. But there's this great phrase, as he sent his brothers off on their way, he told them, Vayomer aleim al tirgezu baderech. Don't argue on the way. What's the meaning of that? Don't get into arguments on the way home. Yeah, Frank.
Have I unmuted myself?
Yes. You have unmuted. You're becoming a tech whiz.
You guys don't know what you're working with here. My grandson will tell you. We see so much in life of families that splinter and spend the rest of their lives, I'm talking siblings generally, the rest of their lives not speaking with each other. And I think the Torah is telling us here way back then, at the time of the redaction of the Torah, that was an issue. And Joseph's reaction of overcoming what could have and maybe should have been rage and lifelong enmity of his brothers for what they did to him. And now a phrase like, don't argue on the way, is trying to tell us, there's an expression, life is short, don't carry your grudges. And we've heard sermons certainly about how a grudge can become like a hot coal in your hand, and it corrodes far more the holder of it than it does the object of it. But we so often see these kinds of situations in families, and I think we're being told here, don't do it. And if you have to do it at some point, overcome it and become a family again, and finish your life on terms remembering that you grew up with this person or these persons, and you should hold them dear.
I think that puts it very well. Other thoughts?
Maida.
Well, I think he set up Benjamin to, reenact his own history. I mean, by providing more access for Benjamin, I think he has concerns that his brothers will treat Benjamin as they treated him. And it may be that these things follow in the way they did because it was his instinct to do for his brother. And then before he sends them off, he basically needs to say, you know, don't let history repeat itself. Let this opportunity here be a lesson to.
I think that's both of what you're saying is really critical. He knows that this is a troubled family, and they're going back to their father. And what are they going to have to tell their father now? The truth. So let's not quarrel on the way. Let's just be straight about it. I've got Benjamin's here. He is the youth, the Na'ar. He continues to be referred to in that way. Let's not be quarrelsome on this way. We need patience. You need patience. One commentator says we need patience and compassion now if we're going to mend our family. And so this whole notion is his farewell is, let's mend this. I really want to see my father. Now his father comes back. And, you know, if we go to chapter 46.
Steve Broder wants to weigh in. He's been patient.
Oh, go, Steve.
So, Steve, I have a darker read on what you're saying. That's almost the opposite.
Good.
Because I've been focusing sort of on ironies that I'll show you. So if you look at the context of when he says don't be quarrelsome, it doesn't really follow unless you look at the context of the first 3 or 4 lines before it. So Joseph then gives them different material possessions that are not balanced. As you pointed out, what he gives the brothers and his own brother is very, very different. And then he sends some things for his father, but it's all about various different material objects. And then he says, and don't argue over this. And so my sort of darker read is that this is the same Joseph who, and this goes back to, Michael, what you said before about not the best guy, a guy who's a real, from his early years, a deep narcissist. And I think a darker read here is that he also sets up the brothers, once again, to quarrel and to argue. And so that's, I think, one of the ironies. The other, and I came in a little bit late, so Marty, I don't know if you said this, but I sort of thought this morning that throughout the country, the rabbis and others who are commenting on today's Parsha couldn't miss the irony of deep in COVID times that we're reading Vayigash, which is also all about approaching physically other people, exactly what we shouldn't be doing. And then it's repeated later where, he tells the brothers, Geshu, to, draw close. So another irony. And then the sort of last one, Steve, you mentioned this earlier, what an irony that the text that's our text of people who are deeply psychological, who, as you said, the people who produce, Freud and psychologists, social workers, therapists, psychiatrists of all ilk, barely tells us anything about the inner life of these people and just speaks in terms of actions. They never say embarrassment. They say drew near, or gave this one this, or wept on the next. So anyway, I'm just sort of filled with these different ironies and a darker read, I think, than we've been allowing for Joseph.
Yeah, I mean, I really think, Steve, what you're saying is very interesting. I really have appreciated everybody's interpretations. I would say that in the context of the Tanakh, we've seen Abraham, Isaac, and we've seen Jacob. None of them have at least had the kind of emotions of tshuva and forgiveness. Okay, so we're developmentally getting there. Not quite. But if we go to the beginning of 46 and 41, let's go to 46. And Israel said, and he came to Beersheba where he offered. Let's go a little further down on the page there. To the God of his father Isaac. Here is Jacob now. And God called to Israel, that's Jacob, in a vision by night. Yaakov, Yaakov, he answered, here am I. And he said, I am God, the God of your father. Fear not to go down into Egypt, for I will make you there a great nation. Myself, I will go down with you to Egypt, and I myself will also bring you back. And Joseph's hand shall close your eyes. So this is the foretelling of everything. This is God's plan. This is God revealing himself to Jacob, who is the person he's revealed himself most to. And again, God reveals himself to Joseph as well. But here is sort of the sealing of the deal, that there is a divine plan for you. But then, all of a sudden, and I don't have much time, I want to go to 47:13. Totally different subject now. Okay? 47:13. V'lechem ein b'chol ha'aretz. There is no bread in the entire world. Okay? The famine is severe. So severe that everyone is starving, but Joseph, as Michael mentioned earlier and as Wes mentioned last week, has settled his brothers, giving them holdings in the choicest part of the land of Egypt. And there's no bread in the world, and the famine is there. And he's the boss. And he comes up with this plan whereby the people come to him and said, and if you go to verse 15, give us bread, lest we die before your very eyes, for the money is gone. And Joseph said, bring your livestock, and I will sell to you against your livestock if the money is gone. So we have the first legal transaction, for those of you who are the lawyers. Okay, it's a real legal transaction with collateral. You're putting this up. And so they brought their livestock, and Joseph gave them bread in exchange for the horses, for the stocks and the asses. And he provided them with bread that year in exchange. And when the year was ended, they came to him the next year and they said, we cannot hide from my Lord that with all the money and animal stocks, nothing is left. Let us not perish before your eyes, before we and our land. Take us and our land in exchange for bread. So now he's taking their land. What is he doing simultaneously? He is enriching, obviously, the Pharaoh. And provide us with a seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not become a waste. And in verse 20, Joseph gained possession of all the farmland of Egypt for Pharaoh. And then in one of the more remarkable phrases, if we go down to page 25, verse 25, excuse me. Essentially, the Egyptians now have to give 20% of everything they produce to the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh owns the land. Now, the serfs, the slaves, whatever you want to call them, they don't own the land, but they get to keep 80% of whatever they produce. 4/5, it says. And then if you see it, verse 25, and they said, you have saved our lives. We are grateful to my Lord, and we shall be serfs to Pharaoh. Avadim hayinu lifaro. That's the words, avadim hayinu. And if we think of Pesach, what has happened? The man who was enslaved has created a nation of slaves.
More irony.
And we couldn't have more irony. And yet, and this is where I disagree a little bit with what Wes was saying last week, these folks say, hey, we're just lucky to be alive. So I don't mind being a serf.
Yeah,
What's the problem with that?
Well, yeah, people's minds change over time.
And what happens?
They get angry and resentful.
And what happens? You end up getting blamed for it. Or it comes back in a great circle. Is this the divine plan? Is this the divine plan? The end of this chapter says, verse 27, Vayeshev Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim be'eretz Goshen. Then they settled in the region of Goshen, which is a very rich area. They acquired holdings in it and were fertile and increased greatly. So the Egyptians are now Avadim. We are doing very well, and we are fruitful and multiplying. And that's where it ends, and it's 9:30.
Wow, masterfully done.
I think the culmination of God's plan is that we get together on Shabbat morning and listen to Steve lead us in an examination of the Parsha.
Very well done.
One last comment. The commentators are all over the lot on this whole thing. That's the one thing I was going to say. Some think he is a brilliant businessman. Got an MBA. He didn't get an MBA, but he figured out the whole concept of collateral. He was a deal maker, better than you know who. He made a deal and people didn't die. Others say this is the ultimate ruthless thing to do. That there is no, it's again a bit of a black mark. To go back on the controversy we've had today. Is he really a good administrator, or is he really a ruthless prince who managed to get all the stuff for his boss and take care of his family too? Kind of like a mafia don. So it's very discussed and very debated. So that's it for today.
Wow.
Thank
Thank you so much, Steve. You did such a great job. We're going to end with Kaddish the Rabbanan. And next week, join us for David Roses, who will be our Darshan. And everybody have a good Shabbos, Shabbat Shalom. So together, Yit Gadol.
Thank you, by the way.
What?
I just want to thank everybody because teachers only as good as the students. And you guys are the best. Loved all your commentary. Thanks.
Yeah.
Goes both ways, Steve.
Thanks. Let's go ahead.
All right. Yikadal, Yikadash, Shmei Rabbah, V'yalma, Dibra, V'kei, V'kei, V'chayachon, V'mechon, V'chayelachon, V'kei, V'adala, B'yisman, V'yiru, Amen. Shmei Rabbah, M'v'rak, V'yolam, V'mechomaya, Yitbarach, Yitkabach, Yitkawar, Yitkabam, Yitnaseh, Yittadar, Yitkabel, Yitkabal,
Diva Atra
Haden, Bidi Bechol Atar Ve'atar. Yehe Lahon Ulechon Shlama Rabba. Pina V'chista V'rachamim. Chayi Arichin U'Misnar V'cha. U'Farhana V'Kedam Avuhon B'Shmai. Amen. Shlama Rabba Minshma. Chaim Tovim Aleinu Ve'al Kol Yisrael. V'Yimru Amen. Oseh Shalom Romav, U'Barachamav Yaseh Shalom, Aleinu Ve'al Kol Yisrael, V'Yimru Amen.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Yasher Koach again.
Well done. Thank you.
Yasher Koach, Steve.
Thanks.
Yasher koach.
Steve.
יישר כוח.
Very well done. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks.